probably seen it in the news, but we're just under a week away from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, unfortunately, as a company, we won't be attending, but what we will be doing is paying very close attention to everything that goes down over those 2 weeks. So with that in mind, I took the opportunity to sit down with Sindhuja Kanteti, one of our co-founders, to go through all of our hopes and dreams for this critically important climate conference. I hope you enjoy it. Hello, Sindhuja, or as I like to call you, Cindy. How's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. The big news is that we're in the final week before COP27, and I thought it would be a really good opportunity to catch up with you, get some of your thoughts. I know last year we published some content around our key takeaways, or rather your key takeaways from the climate conference that was in Glasgow. Firstly, the fact that it's in, or going to be in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh this year, do you think that changes the conversation slightly?
I do believe that the geographical location does impact the kind of conversations that are going to happen in two ways. One, when this is happening in Africa, I would expect that there's going to be more conversation around how you can include emerging and developing economies into the plans to achieve the Paris goals. And as well as the other impact is that it's different when it's almost like a psychological effect that you're sitting in a desert and then you're talking about climate change. So I think indirectly or directly, you kind of are impacted a bit more. Even though it's a natural thing, you're still impacted by it a bit more. And what I also believe would happen is more participation from emerging economies and countries in Africa. Especially, we know that the countries in Africa do have one of the youngest populations in the world. Yeah. So they are the ones who are also going to experience what's the after effect of climate change at the maximum level, if you think about just from a population perspective. So I do believe we are going to have more involved conversations.
And actually, if you think about the context of what you're saying there, those generations that are going to feel the brunt of climate impact, of the climate hazards that are facing them, really, you look at the stats, the continent of Africa has only been responsible for something like 3 to 4% of global emissions. And the actual impact on the flip side is going to be disproportionately affecting a lot of those communities. So it is really, I think, going to change the conversation to who's going to pick up the costs that have really been brought about by those polluting countries.
And I think that also brings back on to accounting, to carbon accounting itself, because if you're saying that, okay, UK should go carbon neutral, US should go carbon neutral, is it really carbon neutral just because you're not burning it there? Because if you're just outsourcing all of your mining and all of the manufacturing to outside your country boundary, does it really disappear? So I think that it should also start bringing the conversation about how we are accounting for carbon. And because at the end of the day, united, like as globally, we are going to experience the brunt of climate change. But unfortunately, there are few countries who are experiencing it way more than they should be as a proportion. So it's like two things: accounting perspective, what are the changes that can happen? And two, how far would developed economies go when it comes to taking responsibility for the actions of the past and the actions of the future?
And actually, on how far will they go, a lot of the commentary that came about from COP26 was that the conference didn't really go far enough. They certainly phased down the use of coal, but they didn't completely phase it out. There were some interesting commitments towards a global methane pledge, the Just Transition Pact, certain deforestation agreements, including Brazil. Do you think the same criticisms will be had at COP27, that we won't be able to get countries to go far enough?
I think this would be even more true for this year, because just taking into consideration the macroeconomic situation with many countries already in recession or with fears of recession, and as well as the Russia-Ukraine war, which is impacting mostly Europe overall, and the energy prices. What this happens is, we call this tragedy of horizons, because these are the things, just like COVID, you can feel the impact of recession or COVID or energy prices today, right now. But the tragedy of horizon is that with climate change, these things are impacting your climate and your overall biodiversity and your life, but you just don't see it right now. Because of which, in situations like this, unfortunately, climate change takes a backseat. And we already see that in few sort of regulatory movements that this is happening.
Yeah, certainly the balance between not just time horizons of feeling the impacts of actions, but also individual interests versus collective interests. If you look at on a national scale, there's certain aspects where a warming climate could potentially be beneficial for propping up budgets and things like that. So yeah, lots at play, lots of different moving parts that make the conversation fairly complex, and means that you really need to ensure that you're having the same conversation, not talking across purposes.
Yeah, and also I think it's also very interesting because it's a lot about perception. Right now, we have a lot of talk across EU about energy independence as almost as a byproduct of whatever is happening in macroeconomic situation. So then the question comes, okay, you're talking about energy independence. So would you choose the route of renewable energy, which would also help with greenhouse gas emissions? And if yes, what are the kind of grants, what is the kind of support that is going to be given out for these companies? So it also is a bit about perception as much as it is about the time horizons.
Yeah. And being able to empower certain sections of society, I think, can not just help when it comes to climate and climate adaptation, but we talked about the younger generations being dependent on work and moving into society as they start to go into these roles. Do you think there's anything that COP can be doing to really empower small businesses to get to grips with their understanding their impact or adaptation, or their contribution towards climate action?
Right. So as a general rule of thumb, in most countries, renewable energy is more expensive than non-renewable energy. And in most countries, you can switch to renewable energy by paying a low premium. But in a macroeconomic situation where energy prices have even shot up by more than 180%, 200%, and having a cap and you still being at losses and almost having to take a loan from the government just to pay your energy bills,
yeah,
you will not be incentivized to switch your energy source, to choose a different provider. Then I think the government at this point could step in to provide certain incentives. But of course, it's about, if they are providing this incentive, that money should come from somewhere else, some other kind of policy that they're having. So I would say that one place that government could help is providing an incentive for companies to continue using renewables or to switch.
Yeah. Basically being able to give them that incentive as to why it makes commercial sense, as well as the moral obligation.
Yeah.
Because as you said, I mean, the big problem with the whole climate piece is if you rely on moral obligations, you will just it will just end up getting the free riders, and like
Mhm.
the free rider problem in economics puts that into perspective for us all. Okay, and if you had to have a shopping list of 3 things, well, it doesn't have to be 3 things, one thing that you wanted to come out of COP27, what would that look like?
Well, I have 2 favorite things.
Okay.
One is a global climate tax, and the second one is a global framework for just energy transition. And for me, it almost fits together because when we talk about a global climate tax, what's also important to figure out a framework on how this tax amount is spent. If you
Yeah,
create a climate tax and if you're using this money to fund low carbon technologies, to give out government grants, to incentivize research around low carbon technologies, around alternatives to plastic, and around reducing emissions, I think it's really beautiful because you are almost using both carrot and stick form of motivation at the same time.
yeah,
And the way of just transition, the way it fits into this is because what people don't understand is there's still, or what many people don't understand is that there are still many parts on this planet who are still powered by lighting a candle or by turning on a lamp. So who are we who are experiencing consistent flow of energy in our daily activities to tell them to not use that?
yeah,
So it's almost like how do we ensure we are not shackling up people's life while
yeah,
still making sure that we reach our climate goals? So it's also about like, so this is one piece of just energy transition. And the other piece of just energy transition is if you have to start building wind farms and solar farms, similar to what kind of assessment you would do if it's an oil and gas firm in terms of like biodiversity and replacing indigenous people, it's also important even to look from that perspective for renewable energy as well. And if that is happening, then do we have a proper framework to support this transition to make sure that nobody is left behind? So I would
yeah,
say that coming up with a framework is extremely important. Every country is different, every region is different, but at least a global guidance with where you have exceptions in certain scenarios, like okay, if you're in this path of emerging economies or developing economies, yeah, you could go this way. I think that kind of standardized framework with little bit of guidelines on where you have exceptions is really important.
yeah. I think not standing in the way of people improving their quality of life is key.
Exactly.
And the difficulty there is that throughout history, that's essentially meant higher rates of energy consumption as you
Exactly.
had to improve your life quality.
Yes. And what's also really important is empowerment and guidance, because there are so many countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia where they would like to switch to hydropower. So what this
Mm,
means is expensive infrastructure in building what we call as hydropower dams. But then, because of climate change, you're experiencing more and more inconsistent rains. But then you have already spent millions, maybe billions, in building this dam. So then
yeah,
it's also important to realize like what kind of technology you're incentivizing in which parts of the world, and does it really make both economical and climate sense while
it's
empowering.
really good. Yeah, really good point, and it covers so many different aspects. The conversation for climate topics can be so broad, and that's why just when we speak to our customer base and we have people that are looking at a more holistic ESG framework or wanting to double down specifically on each of the pillars, it really is dependent on what you want to achieve, and you need to make sure that you're understanding that objective. But
Exactly.
I think that, yeah, go on. Any final?
No, I was also thinking that it's very important to have a holistic view of the domino effect that you might create for changing technologies and changing your energy source. I know that Greenhouse Gas Protocol came up with Scope 3 value chain emissions for this exact same reason. So maybe government should actually start looking into Scope 3 and not just Scope 1 and 2 when they come up with mandatory disclosures as well, even though it's going to be painful in the beginning few years for companies to do that.
Yeah, really. It is. We'll see how it plays out, but I think it's going to be an interesting 2 weeks. There's lots going on. Where will you be tuning in from?
Well, I'll be tuning in from Berlin, but
Right.
my heart and soul is going to be in Egypt.
Let's catch up again when the conference is finished, and we'll see exactly what played out.
Yep, we'll speak soon.
Lovely. Take care.